Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and today's guest is a man who was inspired by his mother's experience in residential schools, and he decided to, after hearing that story and learning about what she went through, to create a project back in 2015 that he dubbed the Indigenous Archival Photo Project. So we are pleased to have on the show this week Paul Seesequasis on to talk about this project, as well as his very recent exhibit that he curated called People of the Watershed, which is a really cool look by John Macfie. It's a look into the lives at the Hudson Bay watershed in that area back in the 50s and 60s, and a really, really neat art exhibit. It is making its rounds in the north, so right now it's in Parry Sound. It's going to be leaving very soon. This is the beginning of April, so it's going to be leaving sometime in April, but it's going to be making its rounds through Sudbury, Kenora, North Bay area. So there'll be links in the description to find out where it goes and where you can find it. But first, before we get to Paul, we need to thank today's lead sponsor, which is North Bay Toyota. It's time to Toyota at North Bay Toyota. From the bold and adventurous RAV4 to the fuel-efficient and stylish Corolla Cross to the powerful and rugged Tacoma, there's a Toyota for everyone. Need extra space? The Highlander, Grand Highlander, and Sienna have room for the whole family. Want to go green? Check out Toyota's complete lineup of hybrid vehicles like the Prius, Camry, Crown, and all-new Crown Signia, and more. Wherever you're headed, Toyota's legendary reliability, advanced safety features, and cutting-edge technology will get you there with confidence. It's time to Toyota at North Bay Toyota, 640 McEwen, or online at northbaytoyota.com for details. So today we are pleased to be joined by, and I'm doing this live, and hopefully I don't mess this up, by Paul Seesequasis. Was that right?
That was better than I could do it.
Really? Like, how do you pronounce it?
I say Seesequasis. In that you did perfectly. You did perfectly, Ben.
Perfect. Well, I mean, it was your instructions, so kind of worked out.
Well, as journalists, we never want to get the names wrong. And Paul, what does that mean in Cree?
It goes back to meaning little rattlesnake, who would have been my great-great-grandfather, I guess. At the time of treaty, and they were first taking down names, they kind of just, some names they just anglicized, or so they knew. Some suddenly became a Gamble or a Smith or Cameron, whatever. But we were one of the families where they kept the Cree name, but it became the surname for everyone who's related. So it never was we only had one. We didn't have surnames per se, so that's how it became a surname.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a lot today, and just by intro, People of the Watershed was a recent exhibit at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, and it's now a traveling exhibit throughout Northern Ontario, which we'll mention near the end of this Backroads Bill podcast. And it's really a bunch of your life's work, because your first book was Blanket Toss Under the Midnight Sun in 2015. But I want the listeners and the viewers, we want to take you back to that. We do listen to our parents, and take us back to around 2015 when you had that conversation with your mother about truth and reconciliation, and you were kind of conflicted by this. What are you going to do about it? Because you are a curator, you are a photojournalist, and the first book was coming out. So tell us a bit about that.
Thanks, Bill. It really, I think part of the genesis for the whole project, if I call it a project, I guess, began with a conversation with my mother, as you mentioned, during the Truth and Reconciliation. And I was always interested in photography and imagery, and she had made the comment that, all the horrendous stuff that had happened during the legacy of residential schools was coming out, and she was a witness to that. She went to St. Michael's Residential School. She just made the comment, that amongst all that, there was strength, there was humor, family, and all those things kept the language and the culture alive through the darkest of times. And that it wasn't all just living through that period, wasn't all just walking under a dark cloud, if you will. And I began to look for things that would challenge that kind of negative imagery. And that's how I came into the archival photography project, and how I began to uncover or discover these images that kind of related to what I think my mother had inspired me to look for. And that was really the beginning of it, Bill.
Well, it's termed, and you'd term it, visual reclamation, and excuse me, and the theme is about resilience and resistance, that I don't know exactly when the archival photo project started, but in transition, of course, the first book, Blanket Toss Under the Midnight Sun, came along, and then this next project, and we're going to get to eventually John Macfie. But tell us about the archival photo project, because this has been your life's work for the most part. I mean, you have been a contributor to the Shikon Nichi, that it's an Indigenous history site, and I urge viewers and listeners to go to that, shikonnichi.ca, and it's SHEKONNEECHIE.ca. And you're one of the 9 contributors of that, because that's a wonderful site to look at all kinds of resources that point to the evolution of truth and reconciliation and the transition that we're now in. So we can all, we being the white people, the settlers, can understand and an appreciation to understand what we are all about. But the question, I guess I should have long-winded there. The question is, take us back to the beginnings of the archival photo project.
Well, it goes back a decade now, as you mentioned, Ben, around 2015. I don't know the exact year, but that's after my conversation with my mother, I began to do that kind of research, and mostly online, which you can do nowadays. It would be very difficult with pre-internet to do any kind of work like this, because you'd have to travel everywhere. And I began to find these images, archival photographs from various collections that just showed life in the day-to-day life in the community, family gatherings, people dancing, people making things, people hunting, all the things that went on a day-to-day basis in communities. And that's really began a reframing, I guess, of what what became the Indigenous Archival Photo Project was about, was bringing these pictures to light, if you will. An important aspect of it was naming. I began to post many of these images on social media at the time, Facebook, primarily, because that's where most people from the communities are. And people began to say, even though the photo was originally unidentified, began to say, that's my auntie, or that's me, or that's my uncle. And then these whole stories and narratives began to come out of that. And I wasn't writing these stories. It was the people commenting under the threads. And that really began, I think, a really important aspect of this project was that these photos actually spur community narratives. They spur this actual stories behind the photographs, which were undiscovered until then, and that would not have happened without posting them on social media. So that really, I think, that elevated the project to another level, and made it more engaged with the communities themselves. And as I did this, more and more people began to follow, and more people began to comment. So it became like this process of, as you said, visual reclamation, and the stories that go behind that.
Yeah, no, I like georeferencing photos, and that's part in of where they occurred. And I wanted to ask you too about that before we get into people of the watershed, just how people feel about that. And again, I have a personal reflection of, I just came back from Washoe or Fort Severn, and George Kakapatwan, one of our friends up there, who took us overland on a different trek to see polar bears. He is familiar with people of the watershed, and some of the photos from there. He in my story that he did about you and what you're doing is that he identified for me sisters that were in the photograph, and it's so interesting. So what? And again, you've mentioned what the people think about that. But I still think there's still lots and lots of photos out there in people's albums.
Oh, I have no doubt about that, Ben. And thank you for sharing that story. It's really wonderful when you hear the books connecting with people physically, not just online, but the actual book itself with people and people recognizing people in those photos. I'd love to know who they were. Um, so it just feels like a continuity, a connection, if you will, between the work and an affirmation that it's worthwhile is the way that people respond, and not just online, of course, but now with the two books and with the traveling exhibition that we'll get to in a bit, as you said. It's kind of evolved into something I wasn't. It wasn't never planned this way. It just kind of evolved naturally, and it's really gratifying to see that happen. It wasn't like part of a grand master plan to get from point A to point D. There was no like map of how roadmap, if you will. I just kind of it just grew and I followed it, and it's wonderful to see this happen.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fortuitous because somewhere along the line, you came upon John Macfie, a person who worked a government guy, so to speak, worked for Lands and Forests, and was up checking trap lines and trap line quotas on the coast, James Bay, Hudson Bay, and you discovered this wealth of photos. I've got a bunch of questions about John Macfie, but please tell us how you came to know him. And I know you did. He was alive in his early 90s, and you were able to speak with him. I don't know if you ever visited him, but tell us about your relationship with John Macfie. And my one burning question, Ben, I want, and I'm going to put it out there right now. Did he know what he was doing at the time? Like, he had foresight, and was he actually thinking that these are going to be important vignettes for the future? But anyway, a bunch of questions there. I'm sorry, but start off with how you came to know John Macfie.
Happy to. I came across John Macfie's photos doing online research. I didn't know John Macfie at the time, but he had fortunately offered his collection of photographs to the Archives of Ontario, who fortunately accepted it, because of course they can't accept everything. They'd have no space. Everyone would feel like their collection of photos or their journals were historical, relics that need to be preserved. So that they're selective in what they choose. Unfortunately, they chose John Macfie's collection. And I came across it online because they digitized some of them. And these photos were wonderful snapshots of day-to-day life through the whole northwestern area, the whole watershed area, if you will, communities from Fort Severn to Moosonee to Pikangikum, all across, Sandy Lake, all across there. And it just intrigued me. Who was this photographer, and how was he getting around like that in the 50s? It wasn't easy getting around. It's not that easy getting around there now, as you know. It's expensive and takes time. It was much more difficult then. So I was curious, and I started to Google his name, John Macfie, and I encountered him still alive, as you said, working in his little studio in Parry Sound in his early 90s. And I sent him a message saying, I'm really interested in your photography. Would you like to chat about it? And he was very gracious in getting back to me. And that began a whole series of interviews. And then encountering more stories from him. And eventually that became what would become People of the Watershed. So that's how I met John Macfie. What was his purpose? I would say he was very conscious of what he was doing. He didn't just. I was focused on the Indigenous side of his photography, but he was taking photos of workers around Parry Sound, lumber yards, logging. He was really a photojournalist and was very aware, I think, of the importance of what he was doing. He wrote weekly columns in the local newspaper. Well, very well-known man in the community. So in answer to, did he have a sense that this would become a book and an exhibition and his work would go around? No, of course, I don't think he could predict that. But I do think he knew when he was doing his work and then later on giving it to the archives that it was of importance.
in my head, I'm just trying to formulate, I guess, the question, the way I want to approach the question I have, which really kind of boils down into, for this exhibition, what the meaning is behind it. So what I mean by that is art is such a subjective thing that people can take their own meanings from it. So as I go through these photos and I'm looking, it's interesting because obviously with everything that's come out with Truth and Reconciliation, and hopefully, and we are kind of moving in the right direction with the relationship that the government and I think the Canadian people have with Indigenous people. It's interesting how, to me, when I see this, it's this very human and a snapshot into like the culture and the human side of the of life in this particular area, and I think in Indigenous culture. And I was just curious what your meaning from those photos were and the work that John did.
Thanks, Ben. I think you're right. What really stood out for me in the photos that John Macfie took was his comfort, I guess, or the comfort of the people he's taking photographs of. It's even it's when photography can be very intrusive, especially that photography taken by people from outside of a community, whatever. They often have a certain thing they're looking for. And what I found going through John Macfie's photography was just a wide spectrum of everything from a woman tanning a moose hide to a wide landscape of a lake, through the dog teams, through the people dancing, including himself. It just was really felt like an intimate kind of relationship with those photos and with the people within those photos. And when I saw them, I thought, okay, there's stories here. And when I did the interviews with John, we began to talk about some of the people he'd photographed, about his memories of those times, and it just I got a better sense of the man, and thus I think I also got a better sense of his photography and why he was successful in doing that. Is he was that kind of engaging photojournalist, if you will, who's curious about people and can talk to them. And because of his job as a trapline manager, he was flying or taking dog team or canoes all over that country. So it was just an unprecedented kind of situation at that time for him to also be a photographer.
Yeah.
And that was great.
Yeah. So when you're curating this, right, and you're obviously choosing what you want to display and kind of go through that, would you say, is it fair to say this is more of an extension of, I guess, what John, like it's more John's opinion on or viewpoint of these photos versus maybe your viewpoint with those conversations that you had with him?
I think I went in there very much like I don't know anything about that part of the country. I don't know the people in these photos, and I know at the time didn't know that much about what John was about as a photojournalist. So I just let him kind of guide me, and it felt like he was sort of guiding me back through time, through what it was like in the 50s and 60s, and through that huge expanse of Ontario, which of course is very much in the news nowadays too. But he just kind of opened that kind of portal to that decade, and his photography it seemed to me just it had to be something. It had to be an exhibition. It had to be a book. And thankfully, after several years, that all came. Different cards had to fall into place, but it all started to happen. It's not something you say, I'm going to do a photo book and it's going to become an exhibition. You have to have someone interested in publishing that book. You have to have art galleries wanting to put it up. There's all these things, all these parts that kind of have to come together. So it was just great that it all did, and I think it has really raised the appreciation of John Macfie as a photojournalist.
Sports aren't just what we do, they're who we are. Source for Sports North Bay is your advocate, your local support system, and your biggest fan. 1321 Fisher Street has grown from a place where knowledgeable experts can help you find exactly the gear you need, to the hotbed of team uniforms, apparel and fanwear, to a community stronghold for all the things that truly matter to you and your family's sports journey. We love helping you find your first pair of skates, as much as we relish supporting local leagues, teams, and athletes. Wherever your sports journey takes you, make sure you visit Source for Sports North Bay at 1321 Fisher Street so we can help you along your way.
When you were talking with him and you're going through all this and you're learning it, what was the most surprising or the coolest or just the thing that popped out at you that you were like, wow, I didn't know this?
What popped out for me was just the resilience and hard work of people. This is pre-snowmobiles, it's pre-television. There's radios, of course, but so many of these communities at that time, there's still a few that are fly-in only, or summertime by canoe, or wintertime dog teams. So that's that relationship. I think I hadn't appreciated it in the way before, as I appreciated it after talking with John and getting his stories, and of people who live off the land, of how they survive, of what it takes to take care of a dog team on a long journey. So all these little things just fit together, and it really gave me a sense of how different, I guess, it was at that time, and how much people depended on passed down knowledge and of their relationship to the land in that period of time.
I just have one last thread.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
go
Bill.
ahead.
I know that you want to ask questions.
Yep.
I got one more. And this is just kind of a little bit off the cusp, but I was just really curious because we know a lot about Northern Ontario communities, especially some of these fly-in communities. And obviously from being from Saskatchewan, I was curious, Paul, what it's like in Saskatchewan. Like, do you have the same style of rural communities and reserves that we have here in Northern Ontario?
Only when you get up to halfway through the province. I'm in Saskatoon, so we're on the prairies. It's flat. It's open. It's only when you get up to the tree line in north of Prince Albert, which is halfway up the province. The further north you go, the more lakes, and you get into the Shield. And then you could, if you didn't know where you were, you could be in Northern Ontario. And there are still very remote communities in northern Saskatchewan. So yes, northern part of Saskatchewan, definitely a difference, but definitely a similarity, but where I am, totally different.
So there are hills in Saskatchewan.
Small ones.
Well, we had
up north.
we were talking when we talked to CBC Radio. Which one was it? Marcus who was from?
He's from Saskatchewan.
Yeah, so Marcus was from Saskatchewan. We were kind of joking about the lack of hills that he had in there.
Exactly.
So John Macfie, I think, established a relationship with the people and the land. And in one of your, in the background, you say photography is not benign. And then you go on to describe, that in working on this project, I've been cognizant that the majority, but not all, of the photographers being posted. Now, this is about the archival project ongoing, but I've studiously avoided ceremony depictions, anthropological field work, those driven by tourism, etc. And so talk about that, because again, I think you've already mentioned it, the sensitivity of the photos that you curate are the ones chosen.
Thanks, Bill. I think it really is an important part of what what I'm doing with the work and curating the work is to, when you think of Indigenous relationship to photography, it often is either about going back to to the 1880s or 1850s, 70s, 1870s, up to a huge period of time. It's often about the vanishing way of life, or the warrior on a horseback kind of stuff, and it gets really framed within kind of a stereotype. And not to say that powwows and things like that aren't there, they are, but that becomes where the gaze is always directed, and it's seldom directed on people's contemporary lives or their day-to-day lives. And that was really something that I wanted to emphasize with the project. And I think that's something that when I saw John Macfie's work, that's why it registered with me in such a way. It wasn't like he was looking for something stereotypically native or whatever in his photography. He was just chronicling it. And that just rang the bell, in terms of me approaching him as a photographer. If he was a different kind of photographer, I never would have approached him, probably.
Yeah, no, I like that. Blanket toss under the midnight sun and people of the watershed. These are, and I'm glad you use the words projects because they are projects. I think projects always include a long timeline and a lot of work, and it's a lot of individual work, and you're the individual. When you look at these now, and I'm going to ask you maybe near the end, what's next? And of course, your work continues with the Archival Photo Project. But do you think it's making a difference now that after Truth and Reconciliation, before and after, that the understanding, and I always say I'm appreciative understanding of knowing and having that open mind that exhibits like that, because we are visual because of social media and the transition to that type of technology. Is it making a difference from an educational point of view?
I think it is. I think anytime people are going through the book or going to the actual exhibition, you have it is an educational thing, because you're seeing not just the photographs, which I think many of them are really beautiful photographs, but you're also getting the story behind it. So often when we look at photography, we just see it on the surface. We know this with our archival photography. Often the stories are lost, totally lost. Like, you can go to auction houses and you'll find collections of photos from the 1920s that, sell for a pretty penny, if you can still use that term. But no one knows the stories anymore about them. There's no story. No one knows who the families are. No one knows, or else very little is known. So what's so educational, and what was perfect timing, was that John Macfie was still around, that we had a chance to work together on this. And I think it provides a weight, a volume that is what learning from something is. And so that combination of narrative and of photograph, I think is very educational.
Yeah, well, it also augurs back. We've done stories on Norvo Moroso and the provenance of artwork, and photography is art. That's so important. So I think when you look at all those photos, you have to, and sometimes it takes time, or sometimes it's just by good luck that you find out what's behind the photo, when it was taken, what was the context. When I look at photos of people of the watershed, that's what I want to know. I mean, what were the people, what were they doing? And of course, some of them, it's obvious because they're at their summer or winter camps, and they're doing things in the canvas tents. So it's explanatory. But again, retrieving the information and writing a story, the provenance behind it, is the real work by you, the curator.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. And it is. I think I was fortunate, as we were saying, that that John was still around at that time, and that he opened doors where I was able to get more background on the stories, do some research, etc., to kind of fill in. You might have a little bit of someone's story, but then you kind of have, it's like doing the foundation for the reader. You have to fill in the other parts, that was going on in the background, and you have to do that carefully, so you're not saying something that is incorrect or not true. But at the same time, you have to fill in kind of little backgrounds, so you have more of a complete story. And that was the challenging part, was to do that in such a way that it keeps the honesty of the original story, keeps it there. At the same time, I'm able to give it a more background context to make it more accessible for the reader and more understandable.
I've been fortunate enough to have, as I've worked here, and like under the Clark umbrella, we do a lot of stuff with local Indigenous people. Like we do the Anishinaabe like land forum. We work a lot with that the Anishinaabe Nation. We've done some stuff with Nipissing First Nation and like elections and stuff. So I've learned a lot about different indigenous cultures and how it's kind of integrated into today's life. And it's been really, like, even the residential schools was something that I didn't even really know about, because you don't, unless there's a history there, like it's not something that's taught to, I would say, non-Indigenous people, right? Like it's not something that's like talked about as much. Now it is because of Truth and Reconciliation. So like learning about that, when we had that thing up at Canadore, oh my goodness, what was it called? It was the blanket. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Blanket ceremony.
No. It was an art.
Oh, okay.
It was it was really interesting. I can't remember the name of it for the life of me.
Okay.
But it was basically, they had all the people who went to residential schools, they had all of these different memorabilia from it basically, and they created this whole art piece. It was really powerful, really interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about, Paul?
Is it witness blanket?
Witness, yes, that's what it was. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought so. I'm not sure if that's exactly what they call it, but that's what I remember.
I believe that was like the official call. I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with this question? This was like long-winded. Yes, that's where I was going. Okay, so I guess my big question here is, who do you think this is more impactful for? Do you think this is impactful for maybe some Indigenous cultures who will connect with this and really, kind of understand this? Or is it a little bit more about education and making non-Indigenous people understand like the way of life and stuff? Is there a certain angle, or was that part of that decision in any way?
I don't think so, Ben. It's a good question. My first concern was that it tells a good story, and there is the visual side to it, the photography that kind of adds a visual layer to the story. So that for me was always the first consideration. I didn't want to weigh the book down with Paul, the political reality of the 50s, or the contemporary reality of Northwestern Ontario in the 2020s. I didn't want to kind of make it a political text in that way. I think there's a political side, there's a social side behind it. And behind it, there's also, mention of residential schools, Pelican Lake being one of them. So that stuff is in the background, but the book was so much about the people in the photography that, yes, there are things going on in the background, and I hope, it gives a bit of background context, but it's more about the positive side of the families and of the people in the photography and the photos. And I didn't want to kind of pivot away from that and make it into too quote unquote educational, or too much about reconciliation, or in the capital R kind of way of making it, throwing that word into every second sentence or something. I didn't want to do that. It really was about the people, and I think that does raise awareness. I think because it raises awareness when you go through the book. I think of the people in those photos, and that is what the book was really about. And in the background, yes, there is the other stuff, but I was really cognizant of taking a step back from whatever maybe it triggers an opinion on my part. I really didn't go there with the book. I really wanted to be in the background and just see it tell a good story.
Yeah, and that's fair, and that's kind of how I see it too. Like the pictures that I've seen, if you try to make it a political statement, or if you try to bring that in, some people can dismiss it. But if you go and you make it more raw and real, like when I look at a lot of these photos that I can see online, it's just powerful because you get to see. It's not just people, but it's people like in this community. It's people in this like living in this culture as it's essentially being destroyed around them by other people who just kind of come in. And I don't want to get overly political, but it's similar to kind of what has happened with immigration recently in Canada as well, where we have all these different people coming in. And even when I was young, right, we've changed some of our language and we changed some of our customs to fit around like other people's cultures that are coming from different. So it's kind of an interesting little like cyclical thing where we're kind of in a manner of speaking, without even realizing it, it's also happening again in a way. So it's just a very interesting reflection looking at it. So yeah, it's a really cool thing to look at.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I appreciate your words on that.
Bill, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, well, Paul, what is next? And do you think there are, as you continue to look at archives and sources of photos, and we mentioned earlier about photo albums in people's closets, and of course we've transitioned from photo albums to keeping our photos somewhere in a digital file, we hope. But it also reminds me too of another residential school story I did in the Shingwalk Center out of Sault Ste. Marie, where someone found all these wonderful black and white photos and negatives. For some reason, they had given the children cameras, I guess brownie type cameras. And I don't know if you know this, but I put it in the story and included some of the photos. In fact, I want to, after this story, I want to follow up on that because it showed, it demonstrated and showed a different aspect of the residential school through the eyes of the children because they had the cameras. And again, I don't know how they got the cameras, but what's next for you? Because the archival project continues, I think, but what's next on your horizon?
Good question. And there's a couple of things on the go, Bill. I do have another. I have a book that I'm supposed to do another follow up to Like a Toss Under Midnight Sun. So that is kind of a promise that I need to fulfill. So, once I get the time. So that is something I'm excited to get into it. It just is deciding exactly how it's going to be, but it will be a kind of follow up to Like a Toss Under Midnight Sun, but maybe more focused on individual stories rather than Like a Toss Under Midnight Sun was very much about areas or regions and communities or towns, but this one will be more about specific individual stories. So that's the next big thing, and then I have a couple of exhibitions sort of percolating in the background on the curator side, and that's always fun to do because you get to select photographs and see it come together as an exhibition, work with other people. So it gets me out of the solitude of being a research kind of writer, and the curation side forces you to work with a team and be very collaborative and visioning in terms of how you're going to present something. So it's the opposite side of how I normally am, and I really enjoy doing that as well.
Well, I want to remind viewers and listeners to Google People of the Watershed and the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. There's an extensive YouTube video interview with Paul. And of course, looking over at my notes, so the exhibit is going to move from Parry Sound in April, coming up now when this podcast is released, and then go to Timiskaming Shores, on to Timmins, Kenora, Sudbury, and North Bay into 2026. And again, they can find that on the McMichael Canadian Art Collection website. And Paul, I guess I'm going to sign off by saying Shikon Nietzsche, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Ben. It's been really enjoyable to talk with you both, and hope I'll certainly buy you coffee next time I get up there.
Well, Well, big thank you to Paul. Of course, if you want to know more, there will be, as I said at the top of this episode, links in the description to check out the exhibit. And I highly recommend looking at it and really reflecting on what it means to you. So if you enjoyed this episode and you want to find more of the Backroads Bill podcast, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast players, such as Apple Podcast and Spotify. If you enjoyed watching, you can find us on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel, or if you want to skip all of that, you can find us on northbayecho.ca, where you can find all of the previous episodes, a bunch of other local podcasts here in North Bay, and of course the video and audio available on there as well. So it's a one-stop shop if you don't want to mess with different podcast platforms and you want everything in one spot. northbayecho.ca. New episodes drop every Wednesday morning of the Backroads Bill podcast, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. So that wraps things up for us here. We'll be back next week for yet another Backroads adventure.